I remember that morning with unusual clarity, as if every detail had been preserved by some invisible hand. The cafe was quiet, the kind of quiet that allows a person to hear their own thoughts without interference. Steam rose from my cup of black coffee, twisting and curling like hesitant fingers reaching for something just out of reach. Victoria sat across from me, her hands wrapped around a chipped ceramic mug, knuckles pale from gripping it too tightly. She had that look in her eyes, fragile, almost apologetic, like she was about to say something she wasn't sure she deserved to voice. "You would be the perfect husband for me," she said, almost whispered, as if speaking louder might break the fragile thread of courage she was holding on to. I froze, not because I was shocked, but because I wanted to honor the weight behind her words. There was no flirtation, no teasing, just the raw honesty of someone laid bare in front of me. I set my cup down slowly, careful not to let the clink of porcelain disturb the moment. "Let's live together and make it real," I replied. Not as a promise, not as a grand declaration, but simply as a decision, solid and calm. It wasn't impulsive, nor was it an attempt to fix her. It was an acknowledgement that perhaps what mattered most wasn't the grandeur of gestures, but the quiet commitment to presence. She blinked, uncertain, searching my face for doubt that wasn't there. I didn't look away. I didn't hesitate. I simply held the space for her, and in that silence, she seemed to draw a little more courage from somewhere deep within herself. It wasn't immediate relief that I saw. It was recognition, a tentative understanding that someone could be steady without being forceful, attentive without being smothering. The cafe itself seemed to lean in closer, walls narrowing to contain the intimacy of our exchange. Outside, the streets buzzed with ordinary life, oblivious to the small revolution happening in the corner by the window. Her fingers traced the rim of her mug, then paused, trembling slightly. I've never said that to anyone," she admitted, voice small, almost breaking. "Not like that, not without joking, or pretending it's nothing." "I can hear it," I said simply. "I hear you, and it doesn't scare me." Something in her shifted, imperceptibly at first. Shoulders eased. A breath caught somewhere between relief and disbelief. She wanted to retreat, to cover herself in familiar walls of doubt, but I could feel the hesitancy soften, melting slowly under the assurance that I wasn't going anywhere. We spoke little after that, letting the conversation drift to ordinary topics. The new book she was reading, the way the cafe staff seemed to recognize us as regular, the sudden chill of winter brushing through the door when it— But beneath each word, beneath each seemingly mundane exchange, the morning had changed. Something had begun between us, delicate and unspoken, the kind of thing that didn't need labels to exist. I watched her stir her coffee, the small gestures of her fingers like a map of her inner, and I realized that the real intimacy wasn't in declarations or promises, but in these shared silences and the trust implicit in staying. I didn't rush her, and I didn't wait impatiently. I simply existed there, present and calm, letting her see that a man could be stable, steadfast, and quietly willing to walk alongside her. By the time we left the cafe, stepping into the crisp morning air, I knew nothing about the future, but that didn't matter. What mattered was that, in that small corner of the world, we had begun something that felt real, and somehow, that was enough to make everything else wait. The days after that morning unfolded in a quiet rhythm I hadn't anticipated. Victoria began showing up more often, always with a small reason, a pretext for crossing the threshold of my apartment, but the truth was evident in the way she lingered at the doorway, hesitant to leave. I never asked her to stay. I merely made sure there was always a chair pulled out, a cup of coffee ready, a blanket folded on the couch. It was not about forcing intimacy, it was about being present in a way that required no word. We would sit in the living room, each with our own book or a stray newspaper, letting the minutes stretch between us like a silent conversation. Sometimes she would glance up, catch my eyes, and smile as if discovering that a man could be still and watchful without judgment. I noticed the tremble in her hands when she held her cup, the subtle tension in her shoulders that slowly relaxed in my presence. It was in these silences that I began to understand her, not through probing questions, but through attentive observation and the steady consistency of my presence. One afternoon, a sudden rainstorm trapped us inside. Victoria sat by the window, rain pelting against the glass, a small shiver running down her spine. She wrapped her arms around herself, as if trying to contain both the chill and her vulnerability. I poured us each another cup of tea and sat down opposite her, close enough to offer warmth, but not so close as to crowd her. She didn't speak for a long while. I didn't push. Eventually, she whispered, "I'm not used to people just being there, not asking, not pressuring, just here." Her voice was tentative, almost apologetic. I nodded slowly, letting the silence speak louder than any reassurance I could offer. Being present, being patient, being steady. That was enough. The weight of her words settled between us, unspoken but understood. We began sharing more of our ordinary lives, little truths that carried significance only when offered freely. She would mention her father's insistence on planning every detail of her future, her fear of disappointing those who mattered to her. I listened, never offering solution, only affirming that her feelings were valid, and that she did not have to navigate them alone. Sometimes, in the quiet moments after she spoke, I caught glimpses of a fragile relief in her expression, like the sky opening slightly after a storm. Those moments didn't demand drama or grand declarations. They demanded steadiness, a calm that allowed her to exist without pretense. And in turn, I found myself appreciating her presence not for what it could offer me, but for the authenticity she carried, tentative as it was, into my carefully ordered life. It was in the unremarkable that something remarkable began to take root. A touch on the back of a chair, a shared glance across the room, the comfort of knowing someone could occupy the same space without the necessity of words. And slowly, almost imperceptibly, the thread of connection began to strengthen, fragile but unmistakable. By the time evening came, the rain had stopped. We stood side by side at the window, watching the wet streets reflect the amber glow of the streetlights. She didn't hold my hand, but she didn't move away either, and in that stillness, I understood that the bond we were forming was neither hurried nor forced. It was quiet, deliberate, and true, a beginning that needed only time and patience to grow. It was a gray Thursday when she showed up at my door holding a cardboard box that rattled softly with every step. I noticed immediately that her grip was uneven, her knuckles white, and I had the sense that she wasn't just carrying objects. She was carrying a weight she hadn't yet spoken aloud. She offered a small, forced smile. I thought I'd bring some things over. Just a few. From the apartment, I stepped aside and let her in, watching carefully as she navigated the narrow corridor with a careful precision that betrayed nerves rather than clumsiness. I sensed she needed to unload more than the contents of the box. The apartment smelled faintly of rain and something metallic, the scent lingering from the storm earlier in the week. I could see her hesitation at the threshold of the kitchen, her body slightly recoiling as if the room held a memory she wasn't yet ready to face. As she began to set the box on the counter, her fingers trembled, and the top slipped. I barely had time to reach out before the edge caught a plate, and it tumbled onto the floor with a soft crash. She gasped and froze, her eyes wide, lips pressed together. "I'm so clumsy," she said, voice tight, though I could hear the undertone of vulnerability beneath the irritation with herself. I knelt beside the fragments, my hands gathering the pieces carefully. "It's okay," I said quietly. "It's just a plate. Nothing else matters right now." She watched, uncertain, as I set the shards aside. She didn't move to help, and I didn't ask her to. The moment was delicate enough without the interference of words or unnecessary action. Once the pieces were contained, she sank onto the stool by the counter, folding her arms around her knees. I sat opposite her, leaving a safe distance, letting her exhale in her own time. The silence stretched, but it was not heavy. It was a silence that allowed room for vulnerability without pressure, a silence that said she could exist as she was, imperfect and human, without judgment. "I'm not used to asking for help," she admitted after a while, voice barely above a whisper. "Even for small things." Her eyes flickered toward me, searching for an answer I did not need to give. I simply nodded, letting my calm presence convey the assurance that she was not alone. Her gaze softened after that. She set down the box with care, the edges now aligned. The weight of responsibility lessened somehow by sharing it, even silently. I could feel the shift in her posture, the easing of tension across her shoulders, as if acknowledging that someone could be steady without taking over, attentive without judgment. We didn't speak much for the rest of the afternoon. She explored my kitchen, rearranging a few items quietly, and I busied myself with a pot of tea. Occasionally, our hands brushed as she passed, a small contact charged with unspoken acknowledgement. That was enough for us, a tiny tether of trust forming between us in gestures rather than declarations. By the time she left, carrying the lighter remainder of the box, I realized that the day had subtly altered the balance between us. She walked out with a small, tentative smile, and I remained inside, aware that this fragile trust, nurtured in silence and quiet action, was slowly becoming the foundation for something neither of us could yet name, but both of us felt. The days began to settle into a quiet routine, a rhythm neither of us had forced but that seemed to grow naturally between us. Victoria started leaving small signs of her presence in the apartment, a toothbrush by the sink, a mug tucked into the cabinet, a folded sweater draped over the back of a chair. I never commented, never made a fuss. I simply observed, acknowledging with my calm presence that she belonged here as much as I did. We shared meals, simple and unremarkable, yet somehow charged with significance. Cooking together was tentative at first, her movements careful, as if afraid to cross invisible boundaries. I handed her ingredients, guided hands without touching, and we laughed quietly at small mishaps. The flour on her cheek, the butter that slid off the knife, the hum of the stovetop. These ordinary details became threads weaving us closer. There was no rush, no expectation of a deeper confession, just the steady acknowledgement that two lives were intersecting in a practical, tangible way. Shopping trips followed similar patterns. She would suggest items, often second-guessing herself, and I would respond simply, without critique. Yes, that works, or that seems right, allowed her to feel chosen, affirmed, without needing to defend her decisions. And I realized that choice itself was intimacy, subtle and profound. To feel selected and trusted without being pressured, to offer trust without demanding it in return. This became our unspoken contract, signed not with words, but with presence and attentiveness. One evening, we sat on the couch with our respective books. I noticed her watching me more than reading, tracing the contours of my hands as they held the pages. She set her book down carefully, almost reluctantly, and I didn't react. The stillness itself became a conversation. Her eyes, hesitant yet searching, spoke of fears she had not named: rejection, solitude, disappointment, and I realized that my silence, my steadiness, offered a space where she could confront those fears without feeling exposed. She began to share small stories from her past, her parents' expectations, moments when she had doubted her own worth, episodes of being overlooked or dismissed. I listened, never rushing her, never attempting to fix her worth. My role was simple yet deliberate, to witness her truth and remain unwavering as she navigated the contours of her vulnerability. There was comfort in that rhythm, a subtle intimacy that grew without urgency. Even our silences carried weight, as if acknowledging that closeness need not always be verbalized. Sometimes she would lean back, eyes half closed, trusting that my presence was sufficient. I would respond with a nod, a gentle smile, or merely by maintaining my calm, steady attention. It was a give and take that required nothing from her but being present, and in return, she received the assurance that she was not alone. By the end of the week, the apartment no longer felt like a temporary space. It carried traces of both of us. The soft hum of a shared life, small habits forming, tiny rituals that hinted at permanence. And in that quiet, unspoken way, I understood that we had begun building a life together, not through dramatic declarations or dramatic gestures, but through simple decisions repeated daily, each one a silent promise of reliability, safety, and steady companionship. Victoria rarely spoke of her past in detail, and when she did, it was with the careful hesitation of someone approaching a fragile object. One evening, as the rain drummed softly against the window, she began to tell me about her family, her voice low, trembling, almost as if speaking aloud might make the memories too real. I didn't interrupt, didn't offer solutions, only sat across from her, allowing the quiet hum of the apartment to cushion her confessions. My father, he always planned everything, she began, fingers tracing the rim of her mug, from school to summer camps, to the friends I should keep. And if I ever failed, if I ever stepped outside the path he laid, it felt like rejection. Complete, absolute rejection. She swallowed hard, eyes darting to. I've always been terrified of disappointing the people who mattered. It's like, even love comes with conditions. I nodded slowly, letting my calm presence fill the space where words might falter. That fear makes sense, I said gently. It doesn't mean it defines you. It just means you've carried it for a long time. Her gaze lifted briefly, searching mine for any sign of judgment. There was none, only the steady acknowledgement that someone could witness her truth without flinching. She paused, as if expecting me to speak more, to offer advice or a quick remedy, but I didn't. I simply listened. The silence itself became a kind of support, a protective layer that allowed her to continue at her own pace. And relationship, I've always feared they'll end. I've been left before in ways that left me questioning my worth. So I build walls, not because I want to, but because it feels safer than being hurt again. Her voice cracked, and she exhaled slowly, as though the act of voicing these ghosts was both exhausting and necessary. I leaned forward slightly, careful not to crowd her, letting my presence speak louder than any word. It's okay to feel that way, I said, and it's okay to let someone in. You don't have to go through it alone. She looked at me, really looked, and I could see the fragile trust beginning to form, like the first light at dawn. The conversation drifted after that, sliding into quieter topics. The oddities of city life, a book she had been reading, a stray memory of childhood summers. But beneath the surface of casual speech, the truth lingered. The intimacy of being witnessed without judgment, of being chosen and heard, began to root itself firmly between us. When the evening wound down and she finally rose to leave, she didn't appear lighter. Exactly. But there was a subtle shift in her posture, a softening in her shoulders, a slight lift in the curve of her lips. The ghosts she had spoken of hadn't vanished, but their power seemed diminished by the simple fact that someone had been there, steady and unafraid. I closed the door behind her and stood in the quiet apartment, feeling a rare sense of clarity, presence, patience, and gentle constancy, were all it took to begin dismantling a lifetime of fear. And I understood then that our connection was becoming something quietly powerful, built not on drama, but on trust, on listening, and on the quiet courage to let someone else carry a part of your weight. There was a quiet weight in the apartment that evening, a sense that a space had been missing and only now was being noticed. I had set the table for dinner as I often did, the plates arranged just so, the silverware aligned with care. Normally, it was just me, and the rituals were habitual, almost automatic. But tonight, Victoria had mentioned she might stay, and the notion of sharing even the simplest meal brought a subtle shift to the room. She arrived carrying her coat, damp from a light drizzle outside, and a small nervous smile that I had begun to recognize as her way of negotiating comfort in my presence. I gestured to the chair opposite mine, and she hesitated slightly before sliding into it, careful not to disturb the arrangement. I poured us both wine, the faint scent of the grapes mingling with the warmth of the apartment. The act was ordinary, but in that small routine, there was a sense of affirmation. We spoke little at first, exchanging fragments about the day, the rain, the streetlights reflecting off the wet pavement outside. Then she paused, setting down her glass, and looked at me, a quiet tension in her eyes. "I've never had someone notice the empty space for me," she said softly. Her fingers toyed with the rim of the glass, a nervous dance of indecision. Even at family dinners, it was always assumed I'd be there or that I wouldn't need anything special. No one ever really looked. I nodded, acknowledging her words without overcomplicating. "I see it," I said, "and I want to make it noticeable, not just for show, but because it matters." She studied me then, the faintest hint of relief flickering across her features. It wasn't dramatic, just subtle recognition that someone could truly perceive her, and that the perception came without expectation or pressure. The conversation shifted to lighter matters, the book she had been reading, a song she had heard on the radio, a small neighborhood oddity that made her laugh. But even within the lightness, there was a depth. She began to linger more at the table, reaching for bread, sharing stories about her past routines, slowly allowing herself to be present not just physically, but emotionally. And I matched her pace, offering my attention, my calm presence, my steady listening. By dessert, she was smiling more easily, the tension in her shoulders softening. I realized then that this simple act of sharing a meal, noticing a seat, acknowledging a presence, had become something more, a ritual that quietly affirmed belonging. She didn't need assurances or dramatic declarations. She needed recognition, constancy, and the invitation to exist fully in that space. As we cleared the dishes together, she moved with less hesitation, her confidence growing not from any advice I offered, but from the quiet certainty that she was chosen, noticed, and welcomed. The empty place at the table had been more than a chair. It had been a symbol of her unacknowledged needs, and now it was filled, not just with her presence, but with the trust slowly building between us. By the time she left, the apartment felt subtly transformed. There was a tangible warmth, a quiet permanence that hinted at the life we were beginning to inhabit together. And in that small, unassuming way, I understood that intimacy could be forged through recognition and presence alone, without urgency, without drama, simply by noticing and remaining. The morning sunlight fell softly through the blind, casting a warm, muted glow across the apartment. Victoria was perched on the edge of the couch, knees drawn slightly inward, fingers entwined in a way that revealed both hesitation and anticipation. I had brewed coffee for the two of us, leaving her cup on the small table between us, the steam curling upward like tentative thoughts seeking clarity. The quiet hum of the city outside created a steady backdrop, allowing the subtle tension in the room to be felt without words. She looked up at me, eyes searching, uncertain, carrying the weight of decisions she often avoided. Do you think it's too soon?" she asked, voice soft, almost fragile. I didn't need to ask what she meant. The question hung in the air like an unspoken thread, delicate and urgent. I took a slow sip of my coffee, setting the cup down with deliberate care, and regarded her calmly. "It's not about timing," I said simply. "It's about whether it feels right, and right now, it does." The steadiness in my voice seemed to reach her, a quiet anchor in the storm of self-doubt she carried. She tilted her head, lips parted slightly, unsure if she should trust the simplicity of my answer. I continued, "I don't need promises. I don't need declaration. I only need to know we're willing to move forward together. That's enough." Her eyes softened, a subtle exhale escaping her lips. A surrender to the notion that not every choice needed to be complicated or dramatic. She leaned back slightly, letting the tension ease from her shoulders. I saw then how often she had carried the weight of overthinking, of trying to control outcomes that weren't hers to command. And in that small pause, I offered a counter, calm, quiet certainty. "I've never felt like this before," she admitted, her fingers finally releasing the nervous clasp, resting instead on her lap. "Not with anyone. Not like this." There was no plea in her words, no attempt to coerce reassurance, only the honest acknowledgement of vulnerability, the barest confession that she had allowed herself to consider being chosen. I moved slightly closer, careful not to impose, merely closing the space with the silent insistence that she was safe, that she was seen. "Then we begin," I said. "No rush, no expectations beyond the next step. Today, we decide to share the space, to live alongside each other, as much or as little as needed. That's the choice." She nodded slowly, a small smile emerging, the kind that starts as hesitation and blooms into quiet relief. "I think I can do that," she said, voice steadier now, lighter than it had been in weeks. The tension that had seemed so present in previous days dissipated, replaced by the subtle, powerful knowledge that she was not alone, that she had been chosen not for perfection. We spent the rest of the morning in silence, arranging minor things around the apartment, sharing space with a mutual ease neither of us forced. Every small act, from aligning cushions to preparing breakfast, carried a weight of intimacy that needed no words. The decision was simple in its articulation, yet monumental in its effect. We were moving forward, together, quietly and deliberately. By the time the day stretched into afternoon, the apartment had transformed subtly. It was no longer merely a collection of walls and furniture. It had begun to feel like a shared place, a starting point for the life we were choosing, a place where trust, calm presence, and simple decisions held more weight than grand gestures ever could. Victoria had a tendency to skirt certain words, certain declarations, as if naming them aloud might somehow change their meaning or expose a vulnerability she wasn't ready to face. One evening, as the amber light of the lamp stretched across the living room, she sat curled on the couch, a book half open on her lap but her eyes wandering, thoughtful. I could sense her hesitation, the tension of unsaid words lingering in the air like an invisible thread. She began, then paused, lips pressing together in a faint line. She exhaled slowly and tried again. "I think I might be feeling at home here." The words stumbled out cautiously, as though she feared they would shatter if spoken too quickly. I didn't interrupt. I let the silence stretch, allowing the weight of her confession to settle naturally. The apartment seemed to hold its breath alongside us, the muted sounds of the street outside fading to insignificance. I leaned back, my hands resting lightly on my knee. "I hear you," I said gently, "and I feel the same. It's more than the space itself. It's the presence. You being here, choosing to be here, it changes everything." She looked at me then, her eyes wide but softened, as if she had been bracing for disappointment and instead found reassurance. She turned slightly, tucking a loose strand of hair behind her ear, and studied the books on my shelf, the small collection of objects that defined the apartment's character. "I've never really had a place like this," she said softly. "Somewhere that feels mine, even just a little." Her voice carried a note of wonder, mingled with lingering doubt. She had lived too long under the weight of expectation, under the silent pressures of what she should be and where she should go. I responded simply, without embellishment. "It doesn't have to be perfect, just real. That's what matters. And being real means you're here, fully present, and I'm here, steady, alongside you." The steadiness in my voice seemed to grant her a small freedom, a chance to let her guard down without fearing judgment. For a long while, we simply existed in the shared quiet, the soft hum of the apartment surrounding us. Every minor gesture, the way she shifted on the couch, the subtle adjustments of cushions, the placement of her cup on the side table, became part of an unspoken dialogue, a language of trust and recognition. She was learning, slowly, that intimacy need not be explosive or dramatic. It could be quiet, deliberate, grounded in the small but meaningful acts of shared space and mutual respect. Finally, she smiled, tentative at first, then more confidently, the kind of smile that spoke of relief and cautious acceptance. She didn't say the word that had eluded her for so long, yet the meaning was unmistakable. She felt chosen, welcome, and safe. The silence that followed was not empty. It was filled with the weight of understanding, with the acknowledgement that the life we were building did not require grandiose affirmations. It required presence, constancy, and quiet decisions that mattered more than any declaration ever could. As she left later that night, I watched her step into the hallway, her coat brushing against her arm. I closed the door behind her slowly, feeling the subtle warmth of a space that had begun to feel shared, the word unspoken yet profoundly understood between us. Victoria called early that, her voice carrying a mixture of hesitation and subtle insistence. "My mother," She'd like to meet you, she said, almost apologetically. I could hear the tension in her tone, the slight tremor of nerves she didn't try to hide. I nodded, even though she couldn't see me. Of course. When would she like to come by? When her mother arrived later that afternoon, the apartment seemed smaller, almost too intimate, as if the walls themselves had become witnesses to the— Victoria hovered slightly behind her, a silent shield of protection, while I extended my hand in greeting with calm confidence. Her mother's handshake was firm, her gaze assessing, not unfriendly, but certainly deliberate. We sat in the living room, the soft hum of the city outside barely registering. Conversation started cautiously, filled with small talk about the weather, neighborhood quirks, and the modest decor. I answered questions honestly, without embellishment, never attempting to impress. It was a delicate balance, acknowledging her presence, respecting her authority as a parent, and maintaining the steady calm that Victoria had come to rely on. Her mother's questions eventually turned to Victoria, the careful inquiries about her routines, her work, the choices she had made. I listened, only interjecting when necessary, always measured, ensuring that my words were neither defensive nor boastful. I could sense Victoria's tension in the way she shifted in her seat, the subtle fidgeting of her hand, and I offered a reassuring smile without needing to touch her. The quiet steadiness seemed to ripple outward, allowing her to settle slightly, to trust the presence I offered. At one point, her mother paused, eyeing me intently. "You seem steady," she said carefully, almost testing, almost cautious. I nodded slowly. "I am. I care for Victoria, and I respect her. That's enough for now." Her gaze lingered, and in that pause, I understood the unspoken approval sought, the silent check that mothers often perform for their children's safety and happiness. The conversation shifted, easing into lighter territory. Books, music, shared anecdotes from the neighborhood. Victoria began to relax, contributing quietly, smiling occasionally, a gentle warmth replacing the earlier tension. I observed the subtle shifts, aware that trust was being built, brick by brick, in silence and in measured words. When her mother finally left, she offered a small, almost reluctant nod of acknowledgement. "Now I understand why she's different," she said quietly to Victoria as they stepped into the hallway. There was no grand declaration, no dramatic approval, just recognition. Victoria turned toward me as the door clicked shut, a faint smile tugging at lips. I didn't need to comment. The space between us was filled with quiet satisfaction, the kind that comes from passing a subtle, unseen test. We didn't celebrate. We simply existed in the calm aftermath, aware that another piece of her life had been acknowledged, her world slightly less burdened, and her trust in me quietly reinforced. Later, as the evening settled in, we shared a cup of tea, unspoken acknowledgement passing between us. There was no need for— The apartment felt subtly larger, warmer, more settled, not because of anyone's presence, but because a bridge had been built, connecting lives with patience, observation, and calm constancy. The afternoon sun filtered through the curtains in gentle streaks, painting the apartment in soft gold. Victoria sat on the couch, absent-mindedly tracing patterns on the armrest, and I could sense the quiet anticipation lingering between us. The day carried a certain weight, subtle, yet undeniable, as if the world itself had paused to give us this moment to decide, finally, what our next step would be. She looked up at me, eyes hesitant, lips pressed together, and for a heartbeat I saw the uncertainty she always carried, the fear of misstepping, of misjudging, of allowing herself to hope too freely. "I keep thinking," she began, voice soft, "about us, about what it would mean to really live together." The words fell gently, cautiously, like fragile glass being laid on the table. I nodded, acknowledging both the weight and the simplicity of her confession. "It doesn't have to be complicated," I said, keeping my voice calm, deliberate. "It only has to be real. We don't need grand promises or ceremony. We just need to share this life, step by step, side by side." I paused, letting the certainty in my words settle, letting it reach her in the quiet way she needed most. She studied me, searching for hesitation, but found none. Her eyes softened. "I've never had someone make me feel chosen," she admitted, a faint tremor of relief in her tone. "Not just safe or tolerated, but genuinely wanted." I smiled slightly, letting her words echo between us. "Then let's make it real," I said, voice firm yet gentle. "We'll live together. Not because it fixes anything, not because it solves every fear, but because we choose it, together." For a long moment, she said nothing, letting the weight of the decision settle. Then, slowly, she exhaled, a quiet release, and nodded. Her body relaxed, shoulders easing, the small tension she always carried diminishing, as if acknowledging that the choice had been made, firmly, yet gently, without drama. We spent the rest of the afternoon preparing for the change, arranging a few boxes she had brought, deciding which items would stay in the apartment, sharing small routines that felt ordinary but significant. Each gesture, each quiet act, reinforced the mutual commitment we had agreed upon without ceremony or spectacle. The intimacy was subtle, rooted in shared decisions, in the understanding that presence mattered more than grand words ever could. By evening, the apartment bore traces of both of us. The faint scent of her favorite tea on the counter, a small stack of books she had brought from her old apartment, a sense of life settling into place. We stood side by side at the window, watching the streetlights flicker on, and I realized that this simple decision, made calmly and deliberately, had shifted everything. It wasn't dramatic or explosive, it was far more powerful, a quiet, steady foundation upon which we could build. Victoria turned slightly toward me, a soft smile playing on her lips. I didn't need to speak. The unspoken acknowledgement passed between us. The step had been taken, the choice made, the life we were beginning was real, and as we stood there, sharing the space, the quiet certainty of our decision filled the apartment, leaving no doubt that something significant had begun.